Hello, and welcome to the second part of our ageism, our cultural ageism week. I just wanted to put together a quick video here to discuss some of the non-overlapping, I guess, information from the This Chair Rocks chapter on ageism. So one of the things that I think was really important about that chapter is it talked a lot about not just what ageism is and the different types and where it might come from, but also just the impact of ageism on older adults themselves, on our society. And the root of that, as we had discussed earlier, a lot of times are these stereotypes or myths about older adults that we perpetuate in society. And as Ashton explained, they sort of serve to widen this gap between youngers and olders because we operate based on these stereotypes and myths and what we think aging is like, or what older adults are doing to society, when in reality, a lot of these things are just what they are, stereotypes, myths, to debunk. I wanted to show you kind of a listing of some of the basic ones, and we went over some of these last week, but this is from the American Psychological Association, just looking at some of the different basic myths versus the facts of older adults. And if you look at the myths, when we talk about older adults, you can see why we have this othering effect that causes some of the discriminatory behaviors that we see against older adults. If we think they're all alike, they're lonely, they're sick, frail, independent, they're cognitively impaired, they're depressed, they're more difficult and rigid, they can barely cope with aging because of all of the declines, then yeah, we have a pretty negative view of aging, and we would necessarily distance ourselves from that. But if you look at the facts, which are very different, then we would be operating very differently about aging if we truly understood that they are a diverse group, they're close in contact, they live independently, they have some declines in some factions, but really it's a limited one. But if you look at all of the facts, if we were really operating on those, we would probably have less ageism. And I think that's one of the things that Ashton does well in her in chapter 1, is talking about, these sort of stereotypes that we have about older adults and how that's perpetuating ageism. In the section where she talks about the impacts of, or the effects of ageism, one of the things she brings up is elder abuse, which is a pretty detrimental effect of viewing older adults as an other and a non-entity, right? So when we have these stereotypes about older adults, as she mentions, it obstructs our empathy. We cut people off from we cut ourselves off from the experience of another group as we're othering them and keeping them at a distance. And oftentimes when we see people as an other group, it limits our ability to see them as a real human being and a person with rights and needs. And this is one of the reasons why elder abuse is partially due to our ageist beliefs in society that older adults really aren't important and they're marginalized. So older adults often become isolated and they don't report abuse, as mentioned in the book and in some of the studies that she mentioned, because they don't think that anybody will respond. And oftentimes we don't. We don't see it as an important issue. We also know that one of the effects of ageism is longevity. Interestingly, they have found that what perceptions you have, either negative or positive, about aging affects how long you live. So those, among other factors that are taken into account in those studies, but if you have positive perceptions, that gets you a whopping 7 more years of life on average than someone who has less positive perceptions about aging. So when we internalize aging, or ageism, when we internalize ageism, it has real effects. It's not just a day-to-day, oh, that has to stink as an experience. It has real bottom line effects, including our health and longevity. One interesting study that I think related to that she brought up was the fact that when they primed people to think about aging in a more negative light than a positive light, people were less likely to choose life-prolonging procedures in a hypothetical scenario. So that's one way in which it could happen, is because if you have these sort of negative views of aging and it's not worth it, and life isn't necessarily worth pursuing, then yes, that makes sense that you would choose less life-sustaining or life-prolonging procedures. She also talked about a lot of the stereotypes that have to do with longevity, and we've been and will be talking about population aging a lot in this class, but a lot of times ageism affects our views of longevity and makes it more of a negative or politicized factor, right? As she had mentioned, of this gray tsunami vision of, oh my goodness, the older adults are going to take over the world and take over our resources, and it's going to be horrible, which is an exaggeration and based on a lot of stereotypes. One of the stereotypes she mentioned was that society is going to be swamped with older people. And when actual projections is yes, we're going to have exponentially more older adults, but it's really only going to be about a 1-to-1 to younger adults or children. So it's not as if there's going to be 40 older adults to every younger person. It's just we'll have more than we have in the past. So another stereotype related to longevity is that the older boom is going to bog everybody down with caring with these older adults, and that somehow older adults are this money pit for medical expenses. But in the end, the reality is that the money pit is sort of these the end of life procedures that we have. So she mentioned in the book that studies have found that it doesn't matter what age you are. If you're 18 years old and you're at the end of your life, or you're 80 and that you're at the end of your life, medical expenses are costly. So really, in a study for the WHO found that age has less of an impact on healthcare expenditures than other factors, including just technology improvement. As we get better and have more technology available to us in healthcare expenditures become more and more over time. And that's not a function of having more aging people. That's just a function of having more expensive healthcare procedures available to everyone. And she talked a lot about how ageism has created these generational conflicts. We'll talk more about this as we get into healthcare specifically, but it does pit olders and youngers against each other. So a lot of times you'll see this sort of misnomer of the older adult is stealing the resources of the younger adult, in particular in healthcare. When in reality, there's still a lot of contribution for older adults, and it's not necessarily just because resources are given to older adults that they're diverted from younger adults, right? So we know that things like Social Security exist because older adults pay into it their entire lifetime. Now, the people who have squandered our Social Security benefits over time, or borrowed against them, or perhaps made some maybe more poor decisions about how to use those funds, have endangered the program. But it's not because there's so many more older adults necessarily. It's just because of the decisions that have been made by administering some of those systems. And that includes Medicare and some healthcare expenditures as well. The other side of the coin that people don't often look at that leads to these ageist generational conflicts is that older adults do a lot of contributing that isn't just workforce economy. So we'll get into that, as well as when we talk about retirement and Social Security and all of those things, but they do contribute a lot. These are some of the sort of stereotypes or myths that ageism is built on, that as well are exploited by some people to kind of divert their attention away from some of the real issues in politics as well. So, older adults have gotten a little bit of the short end of the stick on that, and that is an impact of ageism for them. Some of the more tangible impacts of ageism that we've talked about and that we talked about in the last lecture include, right, health. So we discussed that in longevity. Internalized ageism can do a lot of things, and a lot of Becca Levy's work talks about that. So as I mentioned in the last lecture, if you're interested in digging into that more, she has done several well-designed, highly reputable, and replicable studies on the fact that ageism and invoking an ageist stereotype in older adults will lead them to have poor cognitive performance, poor physical health, poor motor performance, and that's just in a short term, and that's in mostly healthy older adults, as you can make them look less healthy, less cognitively healthy, less mentally healthy, just by invoking ageist stereotypes. And that's the short term and some long-term effects studies as well, particularly the ones we have on longevity. So, we just, again, wanted to hit home the importance of the issue of ageism, and that it has impacted every venue of the existence of older adults and society. It's so embedded in society that we can't even recognize it anymore. So these are things we'll be keeping in mind as we go along, but I just wanted to have a little discussion with you guys about that, and be talking to you next week.